Burrhus Frederic Skinner, commonly known as B.F. Skinner, was an American psychologist, behaviorist, author, inventor, and social philosopher. He was the Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology at Harvard University from 1958 until his retirement in 1974. Skinner considered free will an illusion and human action dependent on consequences of previous actions. If the consequences are bad, there is a high chance that the action will not be repeated. If the consequences are good, however, the actions that led to it will become more probable. Skinner called this the principle of reinforcement. Skinner called the use of reinforcement to strengthen behavior operant conditioning, and he considered the rate of response to be the most effective measure of response strength. To study operant conditioning, he invented the operant conditioning chamber, also known as the Skinner box, and to measure rate he invented the cumulative recorder. Using these tools, he and C.B. Forster produced his most influential experimental work, which appeared in the book Schedules of Reinforcement. Skinner developed a philosophy of science that he called radical behaviorism, and founded a school of experimental research psychology, the experimental analysis of behavior. He imagined the application of his ideas to the design of a human community in his utopian novel Walden 2, and his analysis of human behavior culminated in his work Verbal Behavior. Skinner was a prolific author who published 21 books and 180 articles. Contemporary academia considers Skinner a pioneer of modern behaviorism along with John B. Watson and Ivan Pavlov. A June 2002 survey listed Skinner as the most influential psychologist of the 20th century. Biography. Skinner was born in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, to Grace and William Skinner. His father was a lawyer. He became an atheist after a Christian teacher tried to assuage his fear of the hell that his grandmother described. His brother Edward, 2.5 years younger, died at age 16 of a cerebral hemorrhage. He attended Hamilton College in New York with the intention of becoming a writer. He found himself at a social disadvantage at Hamilton College because of his intellectual attitude. While attending, he joined Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. He wrote for the school paper, but as an atheist, he was critical of the religious school he attended. After receiving his Bachelor of Arts in English Literature in 1926, he attended Harvard University, where he would later research, teach, and eventually become a prestigious board member. While he was at Harvard, a fellow student, Fred Keller, convinced Skinner that he could make an experimental science from the study of behavior. This led Skinner to invent his prototype for the Skinner box and to join Keller in the creation of other tools for small experiments. After graduation, he unsuccessfully tried to write a great novel while he lived with his parents, a period that he later called the Dark Years. He became disillusioned with his literary skills despite encouragement from the renowned poet Robert Frost, concluding that he had little world experience and no strong personal perspective from which to write. His encounter with John B. Watson's behaviorism led him into graduate study in psychology and to the development of his own version of behaviorism. Skinner received a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1931, and remained there as a researcher until 1936. He then taught at the University of Minnesota at Minneapolis and later at Indiana University, where he was chair of the psychology department from 1946–1947, before returning to Harvard as a tenured professor in 1948. He remained at Harvard for the rest of his life. In 1973, Skinner was one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto too. In 1936, Skinner married Yvonne Blue. The couple had 2 daughters, Julie and Deborah. He died of leukemia on August 18, 1990, and is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Skinner continued to write and work until just before his death. Just a few days before his death, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Psychological Association and delivered a 15-minute address concerning his work. A controversial figure, Skinner has been depicted in many different ways. He has been widely revered for bringing a much-needed scientific approach to the study of human behavior. He has also been vilified for attempting to apply findings based largely on animal experiments to human behavior in real-life settings. Contributions to psychological theory. Behaviorism. Skinner called his approach to the study of behavior radical behaviorism. This philosophy of behavioral science assumes that behavior is a consequence of environmental histories of reinforcement. In contrast to the approach of cognitive science, behaviorism does not accept private events such as thinking, perceptions, and unobservable emotions as causes of an organism's behavior. However, in contrast to methodological behaviorism, Skinner's radical behaviorism did accept thoughts, emotions, and other private events as responses subject to the same rules as overt behavior. In his words, the position can be stated as follows. What is felt or introspectively observed is not some non-physical world of consciousness, mind, or mental life, but the observer's own body. This does not mean, as I shall show later, that introspection is a kind of psychological research, nor does it mean that what are felt or introspectively observed are the causes of the behavior. An organism behaves as it does because of its current structure, but most of this is out of reach of introspection. At the moment we must content ourselves, as the methodological behaviorist insists, with a person's genetic and environment histories. What are introspectively observed are certain collateral products of those histories. In this way we repair the major damage wrought by mentalism. When what a person does is attributed to what is going on inside him, investigation is brought to an end. Why explain the explanation? For 2,500 years people have been preoccupied with feelings and mental life, but only recently has any interest been shown in a more precise analysis of the role of the environment. Ignorance of that role led in the first place to mental fictions, and it has been perpetuated by the explanatory practices to which they gave rise. Theoretical structure. Skinner's behavioral theory was largely set forth in his first book, Behavior of Organisms. Here he gave a systematic description of the manner in which environmental variables control behavior. He distinguished two sorts of behavior, which are controlled in different ways. First, respondent behaviors, which are elicited by stimuli. These may be modified through respondent conditioning, which is often called Pavlovian conditioning, or classical conditioning, in which a neutral stimulus is paired with an eliciting stimulus. Operant behaviors, in contrast, are omitted, meaning that initially they are not induced by any particular stimulus. They are strengthened through operant conditioning, sometimes called instrumental conditioning, in which the occurrence of a response yields a reinforcer. Respondents might be measured by their latency or strength, operants by their rate. Both of these sorts of behavior had already been studied experimentally, for example, respondents by Pavlov and operants by Thorndike. Skinner's account differed in some ways from earlier ones, and was one of the first accounts to bring them under one roof. The idea that behavior is strengthened or weakened by its consequences raises several questions. Among the most important of these, operant responses are strengthened by reinforcement, but where do they come from in the first place? Once it is in the organism's repertoire, how is a response directed or controlled? How can very complex and seemingly novel behaviors be explained? The origin of operant behavior. Skinner's answer to the first question was very much like Darwin's answer to the question of the origin of a new bodily structure, namely, variation and selection. Similarly, the behavior of an individual varies from moment to moment. A variation that is followed by reinforcement is strengthened and becomes prominent in that individual's behavioral repertoire. Shaping was Skinner's term for the gradual modification of behavior by the reinforcement of desired variations. As discussed later in this article, Skinner believed that superstitious behavior can arise when a response happens to be followed by reinforcement to which it is actually unrelated. The control of operant behavior. The second question, how is operant behavior controlled, arises because, to begin with, the behavior is emitted without reference to any particular stimulus. Skinner answered this question by saying that a stimulus comes to control an operant if it is present when the response is reinforced and absent when it is not. For example, if lever pressing only brings food when a light is on, a rat or a child will learn to press the lever only when the light is on. Skinner summarized this relationship by saying that a discriminative stimulus sets the occasion for the reinforcement of the operant. This three-term contingency is one of Skinner's most important concepts, and sets his theory apart from theories that use only pairwise associations. Explaining complex behavior. Most behavior of humans cannot easily be described in terms of individual responses reinforced one by one, and Skinner devoted a great deal of effort to the problem of behavioral complexity. Some complex behavior can be seen as a sequence of relatively simple responses, and here, Skinner invoked the idea of chaining. Chaining is based on the fact, experimentally demonstrated, that a discriminative stimulus not only sets the occasion for subsequent behavior, but it can also reinforce a behavior that precedes it. That is, a discriminative stimulus is also a conditioned reinforcer. For example, the light that sets the occasion for lever pressing may be used to reinforce turning around in the presence of a noise. This results in the sequence noise, turn around, light, press lever, food. Much longer chains can be built by adding more stimuli and responses. However, Skinner recognized that a great deal of behavior, especially human behavior, cannot be accounted for by gradual shaping or the construction of response sequences. Complex behavior often appears suddenly in its final form, as when a person first finds his way to the elevator by following instructions given at the front desk. To account for such behavior, Skinner introduced the concept of rule-governed behavior. First, relatively simple behaviors come under the control of verbal stimuli. The child learns to jump, open the book, and so on. After a large number of responses come under such verbal control, a sequence of verbal stimuli can evoke an almost unlimited variety of complex responses. Reinforcement. A key concept of behaviorism, is the primary process that shapes and controls behavior, and occurs in two ways: positive and negative. In the behavior of organisms, Skinner defined negative reinforcement to be synonymous with punishment, that is, the presentation of an aversive stimulus. Subsequently, in science and human behavior, Skinner redefined negative reinforcement in what has now become the standard set of definitions. Positive reinforcement is the strengthening of behavior by the occurrence of some event, whereas negative reinforcement is the strengthening of behavior by the removal or avoidance of some aversive event. Both types of reinforcement strengthen behavior, or increase the probability of a behavior reoccurring. The difference is in whether the reinforcing event is something applied or something removed, or avoided. Punishment is the application of an aversive stimulus, event, or the removal of a desirable stimulus. Though punishment is often used to suppress behavior, Skinner argued that this suppression is temporary and has a number of other, often unwanted, consequences. Extinction is the absence of a rewarding stimulus, which weakens behavior. Writing in 1981, Skinner pointed out that Darwinian natural selection is, like reinforced behavior, selection by consequences. Though, as he said, natural selection has now made its case, he regretted that essentially the same process Reinforcement was less widely accepted as underlying human behavior. Schedules of reinforcement. Skinner recognized that behavior is typically reinforced more than once, and, together with C.B. Forster, he did an extensive analysis of the various ways in which reinforcements could be arranged over time, which he called schedules of reinforcement. The most notable schedules of reinforcement studied by Skinner were continuous, interval and ratio. All are methods used in operant conditioning. Continuous reinforcement. Each time a specific action is performed, the subject receives a reinforcement. This method is effective when teaching a new behavior because it quickly establishes an association between the target behavior and the reinforcer. Interval schedules. Based on the time intervals between reinforcements. Fixed interval schedule. A procedure in which reinforcements are presented at fixed time periods, provided that the appropriate response is made. This schedule yields a response rate that is low just after reinforcement and becomes rapid just before the next reinforcement is scheduled. Variable interval schedule. A procedure in which behavior is reinforced after random time durations following the last reinforcement. This schedule yields steady responding at a rate that varies with the average frequency of reinforcement. Ratio schedules. Based on the ratio of responses to reinforcements. Fixed ratio schedule. A procedure in which reinforcement is delivered after a specific number of responses have been made. Variable ratio schedule. A procedure in which reinforcement comes after a number of responses that is randomized from one reinforcement to the next. The lower the number of responses required, the higher the response rate tends to be. Ratio schedules tend to produce very rapid responding, often with breaks of no responding just after reinforcement if a large number of responses is required for reinforcement.